The year is 1229. Hook. Picture this: beneath the blazing Mediterranean sun, Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, and arguably the most powerful man in Europe, finally steps onto the dusty soil of the Holy Land. The Sixth Crusade has begun, but there's just one small problem. The Pope has excommunicated him. Frederick is leading a holy war while banned from receiving the sacraments. It's going to be that kind of year. Quick preview. Today we're diving into Frederick's audacious crusade that scandalized Christendom, exploring the explosive end of the Almohad Empire in Spain, uncovering a devastating Mongol campaign that will reshape Eastern Europe, and witnessing the foundation of a university that's still educating students today. Context. We're in 1229, a world where empires are crumbling and new powers rising. The Pope wields his spiritual sword against kings, Mongol horsemen thunder across vast steppes, and the remnants of Saladin's empire fracture in the east. Main stories. Let's start with our excommunicated emperor. Frederick II's relationship with Pope Gregory IX had been deteriorating for years. The Pope wanted a crusade. Frederick kept promising one. Then he'd delay. Promise again. Delay again. By 1227, Gregory had had enough. When Frederick fell ill just as his crusade was meant to depart, the Pope didn't believe him. Excommunication followed swiftly. But here's where Frederick shows his genius, or his spectacular arrogance, depending on your perspective. Instead of groveling for forgiveness, he decides to launch his crusade anyway. In September, Frederick's fleet departs from Brindisi with about 10,000 men. Not the largest crusading army ever assembled, but then Frederick isn't planning to fight his way to Jerusalem. You see, while other crusaders had relied on the sword, Frederick was going to use his brain. And what a brain it was! This man spoke 9 languages, corresponded with Islamic scholars, and had grown up in multicultural Sicily where Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived side by side. The situation he sailed into was perfect for his diplomatic approach. The Ayyubid Empire, founded by the great Saladin, was tearing itself apart. Sultan Al-Kamil of Egypt was locked in a bitter struggle with his nephew, Al-Nasir Daud, who controlled Damascus and Jerusalem. Al-Kamil needed allies. Frederick needed Jerusalem. Here's the remarkable bit: these two had been corresponding for years. Not plotting war, but discussing philosophy, mathematics, and science. When Frederick arrives in Acre in September, secret negotiations begin almost immediately. What happens next would have medieval chroniclers shaking their heads in disbelief. In February, after months of careful negotiation, Frederick II and Sultan Al-Kamil sign the Treaty of Jaffa. Without a single major battle, Frederick secures the return of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to Christian control. The Muslims keep the Temple Mount with their sacred mosques, but Christians can visit freely. It's a diplomatic masterpiece. But it satisfies absolutely nobody. The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, are furious. Where's the glory in negotiation? The Pope is apoplectic. How dare this excommunicated emperor succeed where Orthodox crusaders had failed? And many Muslims are equally outraged. Al-Kamil is accused of betraying Islam. But Frederick isn't finished. On the 18th of March, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, he performs one of the most extraordinary acts in medieval history. With no priest willing to crown an excommunicated man, Frederick places the golden crown of Jerusalem on his own head. The audacity is breathtaking. The Patriarch of Jerusalem had placed the city under interdict, no church services while Frederick remained. So Frederick crowned himself in silence, in an empty church, declaring himself King of Jerusalem through his wife's inheritance. Then he delivered a speech to his assembled nobles, defending his actions and his negotiated peace. But even as Frederick savored his triumph, news was arriving from Europe that would cut his crusade short. Meanwhile, Pope Gregory IX hadn't been idle. The moment Frederick's ships disappeared over the horizon, papal armies invaded southern Italy. The Pope's logic was ruthlessly practical: with Frederick absent and excommunicated, his kingdom was fair game. Led by John of Brienne, the former king of Jerusalem who had his own grudges against Frederick, papal forces swept through Apulia. Cities fell. Frederick's regents struggled to coordinate resistance. The very kingdom that funded Frederick's crusade was being carved up by the man who had demanded he go on crusade in the first place. When word reached Frederick in May, his decision was swift. Jerusalem was secured, but his throne was in mortal danger. By June, he was sailing home, leaving behind a diplomatic triumph that would soon unravel. But let's step back and see the bigger picture unfolding that same year. Across the Mediterranean, another drama was reaching its climax. The Almohad Empire, which had once stretched from Spain to Libya, was collapsing. In the Balearic Islands, the last Almohad governor, Abu Yahya, was watching Christian ships appear on the horizon. James I of Aragon, barely 21 but already proving himself a formidable warrior king, had finally launched his long-planned invasion of Majorca. This wasn't just opportunistic expansion, this was personal. James's great-grandfather had been killed fighting Muslims. His kingdom was surrounded by Islamic powers. But most importantly, the Balearic Islands had become a nest of pirates who were strangling Christian trade in the western Mediterranean. The siege began in earnest in September. Abu Yahya had perhaps 18,000 defenders crammed into Palma's fortifications. James had brought a smaller force, but his ships controlled the sea. What followed was a brutal, grinding siege that lasted through the autumn and into winter. The city finally fell on the 31st of December, what a way to end the year. But the aftermath was even more significant. Unlike Frederick's negotiated settlement in Jerusalem, this was conquest by the sword. The Muslim population faced conversion, exile, or slavery. An entire Islamic society simply vanished, replaced by Catalan settlers and institutions. But perhaps the most ominous development was happening far to the east, where most Europeans weren't even paying attention. The Mongol prince Ojide, now Great Khan following his father Genghis's death, was consolidating power and planning new campaigns. In the winter months, Mongol Tumans were probing westward from their bases in Central Asia. The Jin dynasty in northern China was crumbling under Mongol pressure. The Khwarezmian Empire had been obliterated. Now Mongol scouts were ranging into the Caucasus, gathering intelligence about the kingdoms beyond. European chroniclers mentioned strange reports filtering back from Eastern traders, stories of vast armies moving with impossible speed, of cities that surrendered or were utterly destroyed. But these seemed like distant fairy tales to kings dealing with more immediate concerns. How wrong they were. The reports coming back described the advance forces of what would become the Mongol invasion of Europe. Within 15 years, these same horsemen would be thundering across the plains of Poland and Hungary. And in quieter but no less significant news, something remarkable was happening in England. Following a violent dispute between students and townspeople in Oxford, a brawl that left several scholars dead, a group of masters and students had fled eastward to a small market town called Cambridge. There, under the protection of the local bishop and with tacit royal approval, they were establishing what would become Cambridge University. The first chancellor was appointed, statutes were drawn up, and the foundations were laid for an institution that would rival Oxford and eventually produce some of history's greatest minds. It seems almost mundane compared to excommunicated emperors and collapsing empires, but this quiet foundation would prove more enduring than most of the year's dramatic events. Rap UP. So there we have 1229, a year when the impossible became possible and the seeds of future catastrophes were quietly planted. Frederick had proven that sometimes brains trumped swords, at least temporarily. The Christian reconquest of Spain had taken another giant leap forward. And somewhere in the vast expanses of Central Asia, forces were gathering that would soon make European political squabbles seem utterly trivial. Next time, we'll see how Frederick's diplomatic triumph begins to unravel, and discover what happens when papal and imperial armies finally clash on the fields of southern Italy. The medieval world is about to get even more complicated. And so concludes our journey through 1229. Join us next time as we explore what the year 1230 has in store.